Hello, this is Adam Feinberg coming to you from Harlem Stories podcast. Thank you for joining us. And today I am joined with my colleagues and co-hosts, Denise and Dom.
Hello, listeners.
Hello, how are you? How's everything going?
Awesome. So I'm going to talk on a topic that's not necessarily specific to Harlem, but probably impacts Harlem more than any other neighborhood and Hamilton Heights, more than any other neighborhood in Manhattan today. And the reason for that is because gentrification happened in other neighborhoods a long time ago. So neighborhoods like the Upper West Side, they had a lot of SROs, which is going to be our topic today, way back in the day, and a lot of them have disappeared. Now, for many of you, you're kind of wondering, what is an SRO, right? It stands for single room occupancy, and it goes by many more common names. And I've heard everything from hotel, a B&B, I've heard flop house, I've heard dorm, I've heard common living space, shared living spaces. I've heard all sorts of names for SROs, but this is the common name for them. And there's even, I know, a proposal within the city, and now especially with the new administration, that I've heard the possibility of a more modern day version of SROs, that are just much more upscale.
Wow, I wonder what's that going to look like? Modern day SROs. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, there's actually a couple companies that have had presidents doing stuff like that in recent years.
Like Blue Ground?
I'm sorry?
Like Blue Ground? Or
I hadn't heard of that one, but there was a company called Common, I know, and then there was at least one or two other companies out there that were doing this. One was down by literally on Wall Street, but my suspicion is that most of these, I think it might work a little better in Brooklyn. It just seems like that's more the kind of neighborhood where I think, this kind of almost commune living is a little bit more open. But I know that there was a company called Common that existed in Brooklyn and in Hamilton Heights. I don't know if they're still running it, but in any case, these single room occupancies, it is what it sounds like, which means that you're renting a room rather than an apartment, and it's possible that you might be sharing bathrooms
in the hallway,
the hallways and kitchen. Now, I've actually seen SROs where each SRO actually was more like a small studio apartment where you actually did have your own bathroom and you had your own little micro kitchen. But that's not the common setup. Most of them is you're just getting a bedroom. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a setup. But there's a lot of reasons for us to really discuss about SROs in depth. Now, single room occupancy homes, or SROs, they exist throughout New York City. Most of these buildings contain single rooms, often with shared kitchens or bathrooms. They exist largely today as a relic of city living that has long been abandoned. And the growth of SROs were larger as a result of the Great Depression. Though we do know that there were SROs that existed well prior to the Great Depression. In 1950, the number of single-room occupancy beds in New York peaked at around 200,000. Ultimately, most were demolished or converted to use in real estate values and tax incentives. So SROs, as I mentioned, they often go by many different names: boarding houses, rooming houses, furnished rooms, furnished rooming houses, sometimes as bed and breakfast. SROs can apply to renting a room in a hotel, though for purposes of this discussion, we're focusing on townhouse SRO buildings. So one thing I want to reference over here is that what was his name? The guy that played Doogie Howser in How I Met Your Mother.
Oh my God, I'm so bad.
Neil Patrick Harris.
Okay.
So Neil Patrick Harris actually bought an SRO personally that he converted into his own personal beautifully renovated home that he ultimately sold like a year or two ago for something like $7 million, which set a Harlem Townhouse record. But he reclassified it from that SRO status, which meant that he probably bought it for a fraction of the cost for other townhouses, because unless you're planning on living in it yourself and renovating it, odds are it's going to be expensive. It's also worth mentioning in pop culture, I do remember there was an episode of Mad Men where one of the characters bought an SRO on the Upper West Side, and she kind of goes through hell with the neighbors that she deals with, because they're paying next to nothing in rent, and but at the same time it allowed her the income to allow her to buy it and ultimately eventually convert it into a single family. But in the meanwhile, that was a little bit of pop culture aspects of it. So SROs, they've been providing a social safety net by preventing homelessness, increasing the variety of housing stock, and providing workforce housing. That said, they also have concentrated poverty and social problems, downgraded housing conditions in many instances, and as housing prices have increased, harassment of SRO tenants increased to vacates of the property can be sold for alternative uses. So in New York City, SROs fall under Section 248 of the Multiple Dwelling Law. And in multifamily buildings are considered with Housing and Preservation and Development, HPD. The SRO is considered a B-class unit by HPD, which is a residential space meant for temporary or transit use. A room being rented individually within a Class A apartment is also technically an SRO. A proper apartment that is rented on a monthly basis or more will be classified as Class A residence, and a certificate of occupancy, or CFO, will classify Class B as rooming units, rooms, or furnished rooms. So any agent over here that's doing business on rental buildings, in rental buildings or condos or co-ops, they're typically not dealing with SROs unless you're buying or selling an SRO, the building itself, rather than the apartments. I know up by me, I see, the 140s. I occasionally will see like a sign, for like these brokerage / accounting / multi-purpose office buildings, and they'll say, we rent rooms. So those are the kind of places that are typically going to be involved, with rentals, but most rental agents are not necessarily involved on a day-to-day basis. So for the owners or potential buyers of SROs, there's a great deal to know in advance. As an SRO, the Department of Buildings will only approve basic renovations required to properly maintain the building and will not allow major renovations such as layout changes. It's also important to note that most banks will not underwrite loans to purchase an SRO, as these are considered risky purchases and do not conform to traditional underwriting requirements. Residents generally can't be evicted if they're rent regulated, and the owner might be required to maintain the upkeep for the tenants in possession, which in some cases might include maid service and or changing the tenant's linens. Wow. So I know that there is an SRO service that provides that kind of service on the Upper West Side, somewhere in the upper 90s. I don't remember exactly, but it was like between Broadway and Riverside in the upper 90s. I think it was like 97th, 98th, somewhere right around there, that actually provided like that kind of daily maid service.
Adam, what's the cost of renting a SRO?
That I do not know.
Okay.
So, but I imagine that does get into the fact that these SRO apartments, there are, and this is part of goes to some of the risk that we talk about in buying these. And if you rent it out or you're using it like as an Airbnb, as one potential client that I worked with did, he was using it as an Airbnb. And the problem with it is, especially during showings, is what happens if after 30 days they ask for a lease. Now they are obligated to be able to get that lease, and they are now considered a rent stabilized tenant. So that is the reason why banks don't want to lend on these things and the risk of doing it. Now that said, can you do it as like an Airbnb? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's even classified as a boarding house, a rooming house.
So Google says $1,000 or over $1,000 a month to rent it.
To rent a room
rent a room.
and the shared spaces.
Yes, and some micro units are listed at $1,200 for tiny spaces, which could be between 50 to 100 square feet.
Yeah, you just get in the room.
And the opportunity to use a bathroom and a kitchen.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
For $1,000. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Whew.
I remember when one of my friends was looking for an apartment. It was probably about 10, 15 years ago. And, she was trying to keep to a budget because she really wanted to save to buy her own place.
Mm-hmm.
So, and she was being shown rooms that were literally closets. And I kid you not, they were converted closets. And they put a mattress in there. They wanted like over $1,000 back then for a closet.
What year was this?
I want to say it was around 2010 or maybe
my goodness.
somewhere around then. So yeah, I mean that was just insane. But I mean, these SROs, they are actually legal rooms. But
Are SROs still legal? Are they?
SROs are still legal, and that is some of the chances of what we're dealing with over here and some of the complications. So in terms of permanent tenants, it's advised that owners of SROs speak with a landlord and tenant attorney prior to making changes to the status of the building, as the tenants may be subject to rent stabilization laws and all the protections that it might afford them. So that's complication number one associated with it. But when an occupant becomes a permanent tenant, owners must take caution when they seek to alter, demolish, or convert the building, that they comply with the city's requirements with specific regard to obtaining a certificate of non-harassment, or CONH. So this is an important thing that you're going to be looking for when you're looking at listings. And it's an SRO, to see that they've got that certificate of non-harassment. Evictions of SRO tenants are prohibited when the tenant has lawfully occupied the premises for 30 consecutive days, though eviction is permitted prior to 30 days occupancy. If an SRO unit becomes under rent stabilization, the tenant must use the premises as their primary residency, not sublet the space, and pay rent on time. If the unit is not subject to rent stabilization, then the owner may be able to recover the unit as the term has come to an end. This is not legal advice, and owners should consult with an attorney to determine the correct course of action. Now, we talked about that certificate of non-harassment. Receiving that CONH is a necessary step to turning a highly regulated, alteration prohibited building into a free market single or multi-class A building. If that certificate of non-harassment is granted, any current tenants retain their rent-regulated status, but vacant rooms are no longer rent-regulated and can be rented as free market apartments once construction is required by the Department of Buildings is complete. An owner can convert or demolish SRO contingent upon the owner receiving that CONH from New York City's Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. Now, we get into the harassment aspects because this is pretty common, within SROs. Harassment's defined as the act to evict, attempt to evict, or any permanent resident by engaging in conduct that interferes with the tenant's enjoyment of the premises, or engaging in, or even threatening to engage in any other conduct that would induce the tenants to vacate the premises. The owner of the SR building must apply to HPD in order to receive a certificate of non-harassment, and it's highly recommended that the owner of the building hire an experienced attorney for this process. Now, worth mentioning, upon receiving the application, the commissioner publishes notice for 7 days to notify the occupants, if any, and the owner then an investigation will commence. This gives the occupants 30 days to give comments to HPT regarding their living conditions, specifically whether the occupant feels like any form of harassment has taken place. The investigation also looks to 3 years prior to the application to determine whether harassment has occurred, and all occupants, current and former, are able to come forth to allege harassment.
So, like, what are they looking for in terms of harassment, though? Like,
So if a tenant comes out and said, I was harassed to leave,
yeah.
that is a big no-no, and the owner could lose the opportunity, I think it's up to 8 years to convert it to market rate housing.
Wow.
So it is a big deal to, first off, to, whether you were potentially harassing anybody, or even if they want to do it as vindictively, because that has happened, where somebody, basically was causing all sorts of problems, they were evicted, and then they tried to claim that they were harassed to leave. So this is one of those challenges, and one of the reasons why SROs are really so, difficult to work with. Now that they've done that, harassment hearings can take place under the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings, or otherwise known as OATH. Unless the owner has obtained affidavits from all present and findable recent tenants, or no harassment has taken place, the bulk of these hearings deny issuing the CONH. So, you really have to have your paperwork together on this. Otherwise, you can, potentially have to wait 8 years to try and do this again. Upon conclusion of the commencement period and investigation, the commissioner might grant the CONH, request a hearing to determine if harassment has occurred, or even deny the CONH outright without even a hearing. Moreover, the commissioner has the right to rescind or suspend any CONH if there is reasonable belief that harassment has occurred after granting the CONH, but prior to substantial work beginning. So these things are really serious. Denial of the CONH results in the owner being prohibited from acting to convert or demolish the building for 36 months, at which point the owner would be able to submit another application. Without the affidavits, the CONHs such reapplications are exceedingly rare. So again, reinforcing the idea that you have to have all your ducks in a row when you go and do this. The city states that it takes 3 to 6 months to get a CONH, but that's only if the application is deemed complete. So if the owner cannot provide the city with the name and social security number of 3 years of building managers and affidavits of no harassment from the tenants of that same period, it can delay the application. If the building is of an age where it does not have that certificate of occupancy, which is pretty common, then the application will add time. It takes for the owner to get a letter of no objection, or the LNO. And this LNO is much easier to obtain because, these buildings were simply built before the current Department of Building system, even had a certificate of occupancy. So that's a much easier to obtain, situation than the certificate of non-harassment. The LNO is essentially a document that is instead of a certificate. It tells HPD the legal configuration and use for the property, which HPD compares to the actual use which the application must set forth. The LNO can be issued in as short as a few days, but it's more realistic to expect it to take a month. So anybody that's going through this process, that's an important aspect to understand over there.
This process is grueling. I can see why it's such a headache.
Yeah, and the reason why that these, if you're looking to buy an SRO, that's the reason why most banks are not going to want to finance them. So
risky.
Yeah, denial. Let's talk about the denial of the CONH. It's worth noting if that CONH is denied, acts of harassment by the old owner are passed on to new owners. So, again, another reason for all this risk. When there's evidence of poor physical conditions within the premises, or when the landlord attempted to intimidate the tenants into leaving, HPD will often refuse a certificate of non-harassment. If the landlord makes repeated buyout offers, making a tenant feel threatened, HPD will typically refuse to issue a CONH. And if there's reason to believe harassment occurred prior to the commencement of substantial work, HPD might rescind or suspend the certificate of non-harassment after issuance. If work to convert an SRO begins while a certificate is pending but hasn't yet been obtained, this too creates a reasonable inference of harassment.
So let's go back to where the old harassment then is passed on to the new owner. Mm-hmm. How does one find that out in due diligence?
So the way that I go about a lot of this stuff, and certainly, when you go through the title companies, through due diligence and whatnot, they're going to go through and the attorney is going to check it. But I know if we go to the Department of Buildings website, that old BIS system is the easiest place to see it. There's at the top of the page, there's a bunch of areas, where, there's standardized, standardized places for answers, and there's a checkbox where it says SRO, yes or no, or why or nan, and it's either checked or not checked. But that's not the end of the story, and this is where it kind of creates a lot of confusion, because you can also go to the Department of Buildings, and Department of Finance, and Department of Finance might have it categorized differently. You might have actually corrected it and changed it through a legal 1 through 4 family, and it might say it's a 1 through 4 family Class A building, but the buildings department doesn't always say that. So there's all these conflicting things, and you have to go. There's a whole process that I've never gone through yet before, so I don't exactly know everything that's involved in it. But I do know that that there is a process. You'll go through your attorney and through the DOB and Department of Finance.
That's right. That's why it's a good agent if you're taking on a listing and it happens to be an SRO. Before putting it on the market, you definitely want a checklist of everything so that there's full transparency to your potential buyer.
Yeah,
and not just take a listing because I have a listing.
And if you're on the buyer agent side, usually but not always, my indication is by price. So usually the cheaper the home, the more likely it is to be an SRO. But it could also be maybe the condition. Maybe the condition is the reason for a cheap price. But so that's not always a reliable indicator. Plus, I've seen some SROs that are like $2.5 million, which is like the price of a normal townhouse. Right. Non-SRO. So I've seen these instances where price is an indicator, but it's not necessarily be the reliance factor. Being put on that. That's I think one of the most fascinating parts on it. I can tell you though, when I'm working with buyers on for townhouses, it is certainly something that is on my radar, and there's a lot of extra work that goes involved in knowing the townhouse market. For instance, the importance of the width of the home, is a really important point in terms of pricing and in terms of actually selling it. So a 15-foot home is typically going to sell for less than a 16-foot home. The reason being not just that extra foot of width, which you actually really will feel in most instances when you're walking through home, but also the fact that it's a difference for an additional window. And since most of these townhouses are north-south window exposures, you're going to feel that difference in light, especially on the south-facing window side of the equation. So the reality is, if you get extra windows or even wider windows, in that extra width, that does make a difference. So these are all things that when I'm working with townhouse buyers that I'm discussing with my client and being on the lookout for. So I'm looking for the SRO status. I'm looking on the legal family status. So, what if they've got it configured as a 3-family, but it's only a legal 2-family? All these things can impact financing and the deal and pricing, and there's various complications that come into effect. But SRO status is my number one red flag as soon as I see it. In fact, I got a seller lead about 2 years ago, and the owner did not know what SRO status was, and he didn't know that that his home was an SRO. And I had to be the person to break the bad news for him, because the townhouse directly next door to him was in contract, and it was in contract, I think it was something like 2.5 million. And
he thought he could get the same.
Yeah, he thought he could get the same, and when I informed him that it's going to be significantly lower, without even walking through it, I'm telling him there's probably close to $1 million difference. The sales price before it. And he starts getting really angry and accuses me of stealing from him. and all sorts of. Now I can understand the anger and the surprise of all this. Obviously, I was not stealing from him, but but the practical applications of this, it really is rough if you don't understand this. Now, a lot of what has happened in Harlem is these families have passed these on from generation to generation.
Generational, yeah.
So it's generational wealth, but if they don't know that it's an SRO, which was the case in that scenario, it was generational wealth, but it just was not worth as much as they thought, and the complexity of selling it. So obviously, this gentleman did not list with me, and he went with not exactly a reputable broker, and it listed for far less than he wanted, but far more than I would have advised, and it did not ultimately sell, and it's since been taken off the market and hasn't gone back on.
Oh, so it never sold.
Never sold, and and it. Yeah, I don't know what their plans are today, but hey, maybe it's been like at least a year. Maybe it's worth revisiting.
I think it's worth a shout out.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe they're trying to convert.
So yeah, all this stuff. These are all issues of that. Let's talk about vacating an SRO. Mm-hmm. So the same laws that are used to rent regulated tenants using their apartments or occupancy illegally applies to SROs. This includes eviction through non-primary residence, illegal sublet, demolition, chronic non-payment, nuisance, and all other laws listed in Rent Stabilization Code. Where SRO is subject to rent stabilization, it is subject to being recovered for the owner's own use, just like any conventional apartment that would allow a property owner to recover all the units in the building for his or her private or family use once a certificate of no harassment has been issued. However, there's nothing stopping a tenant from filing a lawsuit, which could make recovery of the unit for the owner's use very time-consuming and expensive. So when I talk about obstacles, this is yet among more, in these. Financing in an SRO, and pricing of SROs. Because these are considered higher risk purchases, which situations don't easily conform to bank underwriting standards, most banks won't finance in an SRO. And once an SRO has that certificate of non-harassment, there'll be more banks that will be willing to consider financing for the building. So obviously, an SRO with a CONH is a much more marketable property, and this impacts the value of the building quite a bit as well. But keep in mind, these certificate of non-harassment, I don't remember the exact expiration of it, but I think it's like 2 years or 3 years, before it expires, and then you have to reapply for it. So, that's one of those things. And, that kind of leads us naturally into converting the property from an SRO to a 1 to 4 family home. Mm-hmm. So, once you actually get that certificate of non-harassment and get that issued, there's no more remaining tenant issues. At that point, the owner should consult with an architect to design the alterations, obtain all necessary approvals by the Department of Buildings, and oversee the renovations needed to bring the property all up to relevant codes. The architect will also file for a new certificate of occupancy in this process. And common upgrades that are required in this conversion process are fire sprinklers. This can be an expensive addition if the house does not currently have one. If the building does have a sprinkler system, it's possible the system might need upgrades and sprinkler head additions. Now, I can tell you from past experience, and I don't know what the last few years have brought, with inflation and, trades and whatnot, but I know as of prior to COVID, it was costing somewhere in the neighborhood of about $100,000 to $150,000 to add sprinklers to a building that does not have it. Remember, these are heavy cast iron pipes. Yeah. So in order to put in a sprinkler system, it's not quick or cheap or easy to do. So that's something certainly that you want to be on the lookout for. And this is something that I've educated my clients to be on the lookout for if it's a home that's going to need upgrades and renovations, because according to the Department of Buildings, this is one of those gray areas. Some 1 and 2 family homes do not necessarily need it, but sometimes I've seen inconsistencies or things that perhaps I'm not aware of that are involved, but sometimes the Department of Buildings will insist on it in a 1 or 2 family. Now, 3 and 4 family, you're starting to get more into, rentals and of that nature. So that I can understand. But the 1 and 2 family, homes, sometimes they need the sprinklers, sometimes they don't. But I like to bring that to my client's attention, when you're getting into that. Other changes that typically need to be made. Hazardous materials you might need to address. Asbestos and lead is pretty common in older New York City's buildings and might need to be addressed during the conversion. Means of egress and fire codes, so the building be brought up to all appropriate means of egress and updates to comply with fire codes. Plumbing and electrical must be up to code, because I can tell you, I've seen like some of these buildings which were built 1880s to the early 1920s or so. You stop seeing that building boom happen around the mid 20s. But I can tell you, I've seen bathroom sinks that do not have that P-trap, which allows sewer gases into your home, and you could potentially have an explosion with those old plumbing lines. Doesn't happen very frequently, but it is possible. So that's why you have to keep in mind that, plumbing and electrical. Now, in this case, you're usually going to have, unlike with condos and co-ops, you might not have an inspection because your attorney is doing so much of the due diligence. But in a townhouse, you're typically going to have an inspection done. So rely on a good inspector to tell you that. And I've heard from brokers, and I'm sure you too have probably heard the same. Help me find an inspector that's not a deal killer. And I view it entirely different. Help me find an inspector that could be a deal killer, because ultimately my reputation is at stake as well. Correct. So that's an important aspect for me over here. But finally, the last point that I want to point out: room sizes and unit layouts. Class A buildings, they have different requirements than Class B buildings, so it might require significant alterations. So if you're trying to convert, and ultimately you can buy one of these things and live in it as an SRO status, for yourself. But once you want to trying to make it into a multifamily, then you're going to need to convert it. So I have had clients that have asked me, I'm like, well, if I buy this, do I have to convert it? And the answer to that is no. If you're planning on living in it just for your own family, then no, that's up to you. That's your choice. But I would highly recommend it, not only for safety reasons, but also
appreciation.
Yeah, appreciation. And if you ever want to sell it, honestly, at that point, you probably don't have to worry about the 3 years, because odds are you're in the home for at least 3 years. Yeah. So you're probably not going to, and if you're buying it just for yourself with no tenants in there, getting that certificate of non-harassment is certainly going to be a lot easier, since you were the occupant for the last few years, so you don't have to worry about that, obtaining that. The fastest I've seen an SRO get the certificate of non-harassment was about 6 weeks, and they apparently had all their ducks aligned, and they were ready and raring to go. But typically, I'm seeing it, anywhere from 3 months to like 9 months, typically. So it just takes time to go through this process. It is not quick. It is not easy. And I got to say, there are a lot of homes in Harlem and Hamilton Heights, and a little bit into Washington Heights, that are still in SRO status. So this is something that, especially for buyers at the more entry level points, need to be aware and alert about, because I've had buyers come to me, even from one that worked for one of the large Harlem developers, and said, I want as many units as possible, not understanding that, and then he wanted a specific kind of lender, and they said, understand, I'm like, what you're asking for is not possible, because ultimately, I'm like, if you want as many units as possible, that means it's going to be really like a commercial, scenario with rent control, rent stabilization. It's a much more complicated situation, and most banks do not want to deal with this. So odds are you're buying this all cash. Mm-hmm. This particular buyer did not have the cash. They only had maybe 10 or 15% to put up. Now, that said, it is worth mentioning that it may be possible to find a banker that is willing to finance it. But think of it more like an investment property where, if you find one that banker that is willing to finance in these kind of situations, understand that odds are they're going to want anywhere a minimum of 35 to 50% down. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, I've had bankers in the past that would finance SROs, and they've changed their policies, do not lend to SROs anymore. And I know that there's still a handful out there, but they don't come around very easily, and there's no guarantee that they're going to underwrite in either your project or SROs as a whole. So it's not something that you can really count on if you're in that market to buy.
Adam, thanks for bringing this to the table. I guess maybe I can speak for maybe even Dom or some agents that SRO is not something that's that we deal with a lot. So this information is invaluable, and really thanks for bringing this to the table. And it's this piece is a great educational piece for me anyway.
And I tend to say this is a real eye-opener for a lot of people out there. They just there's not really much information out there.
I didn't really know that most Harlem townhouses were SROs.
Well, not necessarily most, but there
a
are
lot, a number.
But there's far too many out there,
okay.
and they're very, very complicated situations.
No, this was good. This was good information.
So this is something I like. I always feel like this is worth bringing the attention to whether you're a seller of an SRO or whether you're looking to buy a townhouse and weren't already familiar with the SROs and the sheer number of them. But I get so many inquiries that ask me, I'm like, oh, I've got a budget of like 1.4. I'm going to finance like half. And I'm like, well, 1.4, you're either talking about something that is really just a shell, or which there aren't a whole lot of shells anymore. Mm-hmm. That's another big difference in the neighborhood between when I first moved in about 20 years ago and today. There were a lot of shells back then, and today there aren't as many shells, but they're still out there, and some of them aren't obvious, but are shells. And, they're either going to be a shell or an SRO or potentially both. So that those entry-level price points, this is a conversation that I often wind up having. And I get a buyer that's so excited, and I always hate bursting their bubble, when we, have to cover this kind of topic. Not fun, but I think it's absolutely
worth it. Definitely worth it.
Yeah, and definitely worth it, and it kind of, as brokers, it kind of sets us apart, the fact that that we're educated or now educated on this topic, because it's something that very few people talk about. Now, like I said early in this episode, that there was that episode of Man where one of the assistants in the show winds up buying an SRO on the Upper West Side. Those neighborhoods went through gentrification, decades prior to Harlem and Hamilton Heights and Washington Heights. So it was far more common to find them on the Upper West Side, than today. I doubt there are many out there that still exist. They're kind of far and few between. Is it possible to stumble upon one? Yeah, absolutely, but not very common today.
All right.
So with that, I think that wraps us up. Any other feedback, or are we ready to call it a day?
Yeah, this was great. I definitely enjoyed, this episode.
Awesome. That's the true objective, is to entertain and inform at the same time, and I think we have accomplished that.
Yes, we have.
So with that, I want to bid you goodbye. But if you like this episode, if you like Harlem Stories,
give us a like.
Give us a like. Hit that
please.
Like button and share it, and let everyone in your network know about these episodes. We talk not just about Harlem, but also everything that surrounds Harlem, from a real estate perspective and cultural and all sorts of things. So, thank you very much for your time. You've been a great audience.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening. Have a great day.